Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into something, well, it's fascinating and maybe a little uncomfortable, the biological limits of our own morality. You know, we like to think our conscience is this boundless source of good, but it turns out the science tells a very, very different story. So let's just jump right in with a puzzle. How is it that the story of one single child trapped in a well can capture the entire world's attention, raising millions of dollars, while headlines about the suffering of a million people can just feel like another statistic we scroll past? What gives? Are we just heartless, or is there something deeper going on in our wiring? Well, the answer, it turns out, is no. It's not about you being a good or a bad person. It's about a fundamental mismatch. We are all running this incredibly complex, modern, global society on hardware that was designed for the Stone Age. Our brains, put simply, were not built for this. Okay, so to really understand this, let's start by looking inside the brain itself. I mean, where does our conscience physically live?
What neuroscience shows us is this constant tug of war happening inside our skulls. You've got two systems. First, there's the automatic system, your gut. It's lightning fast, it's emotional, it's that little alarm bell that just screams, hey, that's wrong. Then you've got the manual system, your head. This is your slow, logical, deliberate thought process, and it's centered in a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMFPC for short. That's the part that says, okay, hang on a second, let's think this through. A healthy moral decision needs both of these systems working together.
And we know just how critical that connection is because we've seen what happens when it gets physically broken. There's a condition called acquired sociopathy, and it's just wild. When that VMPFC gets damaged, a person can still ace an IQ test, they can even explain complex ethical theories, but they can't feel what's right or wrong anymore. The signal from the gut just goes silent. And without it, their entire moral compass completely falls apart. And this timeline shows the first and probably the most famous example. Back in 1848, a railroad foreman named Phineas Gage had a tamping iron, a huge metal rod, blown straight through his frontal lobe. Miraculously, he survived, but the Phineas Gage that everyone knew was gone. This responsible, well-liked guy became profane, impulsive, and unreliable. His doctor brilliantly observed that the balance between his intellect and his emotions had been destroyed. Gage's skull was the first real proof that morality isn't some mystical property of a soul. It's a fragile state that depends on the physical wiring of your brain. And this isn't just some dusty old story. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio studied a modern patient he called Elliot, who had similar brain damage from a tumor. Just like Gage, Elliot's logic was perfectly intact, but his life was a mess. Why? Because he was paralyzed by even the simplest decisions. He'd spend an entire afternoon debating where to eat lunch, analyzing every single variable, because he couldn't feel a preference. And this is what Damasio realized. Without our gut feelings to tag things as good or bad, pure reason just spins its wheels forever. You can't make a logical choice, let alone a moral one. So if our brain's hardware is physically limited, how does that play out in our social lives? Well, this brings us to the software. If our moral feelings are a finite resource, then how many people can we actually genuinely care about at one time? The research points to these circles of connection. And at the very, very center, your brain can really only handle about 5 people. This is your intimate support clique. These are the people you'd call at 3 a.m. for anything, no questions asked. Go out one more ring, and you get to your sympathy group. This is about 15 people. These are the people whose death would be absolutely devastating to you. Your closest friends, your family. You feel deep personal empathy for them. And that brings us to the big one, the outer limit. An anthropologist named Robin Dunbar figured out that the absolute cognitive ceiling for maintaining stable social relationships is around 150 people. This is Dunbar's number. It's basically the maximum size of a functional human tribe, where you can still know who everyone is and how they all relate to each other. Once you get beyond 150, our brains they run out of bandwidth. People stop being real individual humans and they become abstractions. They become stereotypes or statistics. This creates what you could call a massive empathy gap. Our emotional system evolved to be a spotlight, right? To focus intensely on our little tribe. It was never designed to be a floodlight to illuminate the entire planet. And that's why we feel for the one child, but not the million. The million are just outside our brain's built-in emotional and cognitive limits. Okay, now this is where it gets really uncomfortable. If our moral hardware and software have these known limits, how do modern systems exploit them? How do they allow otherwise good, normal people to end up participating in terrible things? Well, the psychologist Albert Bandura identified these things he called mechanisms of moral disengagement. They're basically these clever and often totally unconscious mental tricks we use to switch off our own conscience. We use sanitized language, euphemisms, to hide what's really happening. We spread the responsibility across a group so no single person feels the weight of it. We push it off onto an authority figure, just following orders. And of course, we dehumanize the victims, so our empathy circuits don't even have to fire. This table, wow, this is a chilling, real-world example of those mechanisms in action. Back in the 70s, Ford knew their Pinto had a fatal flaw that could make it explode. But instead of fixing it, they literally did the math. They calculated that fixing the car would cost $137 million, but paying out damages for all the people they predicted would die or be horribly burned, only $49.5 million. By using the abstract language of a cost-benefit analysis, they disengaged their morality and decided it was cheaper to let people burn. Enron did the exact same thing, but with words. They didn't commit fraud. They engaged in creative accounting. They didn't blackmail the state of California by shutting down power plants for profit. No, they used a strategy codenamed Death Star. These words act like a moral anesthetic. They let employees do deeply unethical things without ever feeling the true weight of their actions. Now, one of the most famous stories about our moral limits is the murder of Kitty Genovese. It became the textbook case of the bystander effect, the idea that if you're in a crowd, no one will help because they all assume someone else will. But here's the thing. The story we all know is basically a myth. The reality is way more complicated. Nobody actually saw the whole thing. People did shout from their windows, and it scared the attacker away for a while. At least 2 people did call the police, and one woman, a neighbor, ran down to hold Kitty as she died. The failure here wasn't cold, heartless apathy. It was ambiguity. People were confused. They didn't know if it was a lover's quarrel or a violent assault. Our brains tend to freeze when we can't make sense of a situation. The moral limit wasn't a lack of caring, it was a crisis of clarity. So, if our brains are saddled with these ancient, limited, and easily tricked systems, are we just doomed? Is that it? Well, no. The answer is yes, we can absolutely do something about it. The solution starts with consciously recognizing our brain's 2 modes. Our default setting is automatic mode. That's our tribal, emotional gut reaction. It's great for solving problems inside our small group, me versus us, but for the huge, complex, global problems we face today, the us versus them problems, we have to intentionally flip the switch to manual mode. That's our capacity for slow, deliberate, cool-headed reason. The solution isn't to feel more, it's to think better. This really shows us the path forward. Since we can't just get a hardware upgrade for our brains, we have to build better systems on the outside. We have to create what you could call external frontal lobes, things like strong laws, transparent institutions, and clear, non-negotiable ethical codes. These systems act like a societal failsafe for our flawed biological instincts. They force us to consider the stranger outside our tribe and the long-term consequences our gut would rather just ignore. Ultimately, what the science shows us is that our biology is not our destiny. Just knowing about these limits is the very first, most important step to overcoming them. It lets us stop blaming our failures on some flaw in our character and start designing smarter, more humane systems. So the final thought I'll leave you with is this. Now that you know about your brain's default settings and its biases, how will you choose to engage your manual mode?